2012 is 3 years after the election of Jacob Zuma as the president of the African National Congress, the ruling party, and then he became the president of the country. By 2012, Jacob Zuma had already been accused and tried of rape, and acquitted in the trial on grounds that many people, I won't go into the detail, thought was a travesty of even the formal law, let alone a travesty of justice, which is a separate matter. By 2012, he was also known, it was well known that he was deeply implicated in acts of corruption using state resources for private benefit. So here we have an exhibition by Brett Murray, a white male artist who had previously been deeply embedded in ANC activism. It was called Hail to the Thief. Hail to the Thief, playing on the notion of the chief, which is speaking to South African conceptions of traditional authority. And it was this painting called The Spear, which depicted the ANC and South African President Jacob Zuma as this glorious, larger-than-life revolutionary with his genitalia exposed, right? There were other paintings in this exhibition, such as these, which went equally directly to the heart of what the artist thought was the problem with the party, which is that it had put the legacy of the party as well as the country up for sale. Okay, so that's the logo of the ANC in the background, and it's stamped over with for sale and sold. Within 10 days, the president sued the artist, he sued the gallery, and thousands of supporters of the president took to the streets, calling for the artist to be stoned to death. In the middle of this drama, 2 people went into the gallery and smeared red and black paint over the painting. The people who rushed to the defense of the dignity of the president were people like this: the ANC Women's League, women who had long been organized under the banner of the ANC and had been, this was the organization that inside the ANC had carried the idea of gender equality into the ANC, but here it was defending the honor of the president. Here you see how younger members of the ANC came out dressed in combats. This is a very direct and threatening response. This was a kind of clash about what the nature of democracy was to be. On the one hand, you had the idea of the importance of defending the racial dignity of the president against a perception that this white artist was doing something profoundly disrespectful. And on the other hand, you have an argument that it's because the artist is white that he is doing this, right? So this kind of entangled the question of who belongs in South Africa, who has the right to criticize, who is an authentic citizen, with the question of what can be said and what cannot be said. The identity of the artist became a matter of debate. But what I think is very obvious about it from a feminist reading is masculinized power. I mean, I see that all over this painting, and that was never up for discussion. What was up for discussion was the racial dignity of the president. And what worried me about the way the debate was being framed is that it pushed out of, it made feminist critiques also stand in a position of doubt in relation to the question of what kind of society we wanted to build. We were either going to build a society in which the dignity of black people was to be defended, or what, right? We couldn't talk about the phallic nature of power, the ways in which this president, in particular, is implicated in the question of rape. We couldn't talk about the issue of how the ANC leadership in general and all political leadership in South Africa has avoided questions of the rights of women. And it felt like in this debate, radical critics were being forced to take a stand. And the stand that was being demanded was a stand that was rather simplistically in defense of the right of black people not to be offended. So that's the intervention the paper is trying to make, and it is an intervention that I think got some traction in South Africa a little later, because following 2012, actually in 2015, we had the rise of a student movement. That in 2009, when Jacob Zuma was elected the president, people people in the ANC and even the left in the ANC were very adamant that he was going to bring a different kind of ANC, and we should push aside the question of his sexual politics. We should push aside this question of rape, because it was not as important as the kind of democratic changes that he would bring in displacing the previous president, Thabo Mbeki. And the feminist activists across society critiqued having to make that choice, refused to make that choice, and broke with the ANC and rebuilt movements in civil society, which were very important in subsequent years, and kept alive the question of sexualized power and politics throughout the period from 2006, actually, which is when the rape trial happened, to the present, and I think have been responsible in part for the current situation, which is the one where we have, now finally seen the moment in which the president is removed. He's no longer the president. It kept that alive at many moments, and there are many interesting performative ways in which the question was kept alive. One of them was took place in 2016, at the moment in which local government results were being announced, and the president stood up in this big hall to announce the final, to celebrate the fact that the ANC had won a number of municipalities, and 4 young women from my university, some of whom Adrian knows, moved to the front of the stage and held up banners that said, "Remember Kwezi." That's all it said. So remember Kwezi. Kwezi is the woman who accused the president of raping her. The student movement, in which these 4 young women were embedded, continued to hold up that argument that we should not have to choose to be queer or black. We should not have to choose to be feminist or black. Anyway, this banner, which captures exactly the argument that was being made by the students, and is the argument of this paper, that if we think of identities in these very discrete ways and in terms of a hierarchy, of a choice that has to be made, we end up excluding some really important questions of who are the subjects of our struggle, who is liberation for, what are the parameters of freedom as we imagine it. Is it only for some people and not others? Is it only about certain questions that are comfortable to be dealt with within the political sphere, or is it also about other kinds of questions? And so this poster really, I feel like my entire paper could just, that's what it is about. It came after the paper was written, but that's it really in a nutshell. What the argument is that if you push people into having to make these kinds of choices that say the one identity is more important than the other, you are reinscribing hierarchies of oppression, not moving towards what is called democracy. And it is interesting to me how many traditional cultures all over the world are invested in certain forms of violent masculinities, in which, dare I say it, weapons are seen to be an essential element of the culture. So it's violence even in its most overt forms, and that can't be separated from less obvious forms of violence anymore. And so this appeal here in the case of Zuma, he's appealing to, a set of what on the surface he is arguing are traditional African values. They're not really, and there are many people who would contest that, but the people who would contest that get written out of the debate because they are pushed into the kind of camp of being traitors or not fully on board with the importance of restoring.
After all, my culture allows me to have 5 wives, 6 wives,
right.
19 children.
Or my culture allows me to have 5 guns, 6
That's
guns,
right.
guns like this, guns like.
I come from a country where the cry of racial justice obscured the cry for gender decency in the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. So I know that there is this tension, but sometimes one has to give priority to one addressing one evil over another, and I think it's a political judgment, and it may be actually right now in South Africa, and maybe here, the idea of giving priority to gender and sexual justice should be given and not race. But still, I think that we have to confront the fact that sometimes you have to kind of give. I don't even know if I believe exactly what I'm saying, but I think that it's I want to raise the issue. In a moment, I'll tell you why I think that what I just said is wrong. But because
I can also tell you why.
Yeah, but I'd rather hear it
because
from
we
you.
lived through that.
I'd rather hear it from you.
Yeah.
No, because I think what I'm arguing is we have to refuse.
I know that.
The choice, that these are choices, one or the other, because I think that these are actually allied projects, right? If we're thinking that politically what we are about is a society in which people are free to be who they are and free to explore to live the best lives they can, in a very simple way, right? Not particularly theoretical. Then we have to think about the ways in which we can craft a language that puts struggles against racism together with, not against, struggles for gender justice, and does not refigure, for strategic reasons, a heteronormative, a patriarchal conception of community, because then we're not, and simply calling it black as opposed to white heteronormative values doesn't reconfigure our society at all. So I think if you want to be a Democrat, you have to find, of a small d, in this country I should say small d, Democrat, you have to find that language and you have to do that work. But in politics, what happens, and I'm talking mostly about what happens broadly on the left here, because that's where the papers, it's comrades I'm trying to argue with, is that you have the rise of this, group called bro-socialists, right? You all know them. They're the men who say, yes, that's really important, but, in politics, we sometimes have to make choices. Well, why was it so urgent that the one choice has to be made over the bodies of others? That seems to me the question that has to be put up there, and it's too easy. It's too easy to say that, well, in particular moments you only have a limited set of options. What are we doing to craft a different set of options? And if we go into, at least in South Africa, we go into the future in which we either think about gender equality as so important that we put in place a certain version of, what's called white liberal feminism, which we have a version of in our government. We're doing an injustice to black women. And if we put in place a project that is purely about some notion of a homogeneous black identity, we're doing an injustice to queer black people. And so it's old language, it's not useful.
I think that Jeff also,
he's being provocative.
I just wanted to open up the conversation.
And I think that's why I like that poster. I think there is a discussion beginning that is trying to craft a different language for making political choices.
And the dear history appeal, dear history, listen to me. We already been there. We have been there. When Jeff said, there is a need for, this is actually a political judgment. What are the priorities? Is this the priority of the moment? Or is something else a priority of the moment? We've been there. Women have fought for democracy. Where are they now? Right? Why is it? We talked about it earlier here in this class too. Why is it that at the end it is all over it is a male power which speaks for the rest of the nation. So, dear history, I think it's an amazing kind of appeal. Listen to us. We are much more diverse even than just men and women. Look at us. Notice that we have been always like that. You didn't want to notice it.
So the way I would address, as I was speaking, I started hearing my own critical voice say, "Wait a second, Jeff, you're not saying really what you mean." And that voice is a kind of echoing of Hannah Arendt, where she tells me always that in politics, the means are the ends. So that the way you do politics, even just ends are one thing, but ends are very, very difficult. But that the way you do politics, it actually is a significant way in which you constitute the consequences of your actions. So I think that speaks to both moments. That the moment of constitution making, where certain formal kind of rights and capacities were institutionalized in South Africa, that didn't mean the end was achieved. You had to then still proceed politically in a way that you're constituting the ends in your actions at the moment. That's personally, that's the core of my theoretical commitments and political commitments. And it doesn't have to be everyone's, but that's really where I am. But still, we are faced with dilemmas. If you're interested fully in gender equality, then rejecting fellow feminists who have a different position than you do on the organization of the political economy is actually necessary. So radical feminists and liberal feminists have some grounds for solidarity. But if at the same time you're a radical feminist and you believe in the radical transformation of the political economy, then at some point you have to have solidarity with people who are, let's kind of simplify, want to work with you in the creation of socialism. And if they're not quite right on issues of gender, you have to proceed. And I think that it's a mistake not to understand that we live in this complex world and these things, we have to face these things. Nonetheless, realizing that the way we do politics makes it possible for us to realize our ends or have our ends elude us, and find that the great tragedy in South Africa is find that the enemy has become us.
Yeah. In certain ways, it doesn't matter if who is in power is male or female, quite, because it's what the agenda is that they're carrying, right? That matters. So for me, the break is actually even within feminism, that feminists themselves have had to think about breaking with certain types of feminism that act as a kind of continual misdirection. They take up so much space that they misdirect what the aims, they misdirect us to think about a kind of lean-in type of politics, right? So that version of feminism is actually a problem, because it makes it very difficult to see what the core of addressing hierarchies of gender really entails. The economy is structured around gender. It is structured around the greater degree of exploitability of women's labor, unpaid labor in particular. It's structured around global differences between the exploitability of women. So it's, if you're not, you can be in the US and call yourself a feminist, but be upholding a system in which you are reproducing inequalities in other parts of the world in quite active ways. It is about the rights to reproductive autonomy. It's about the right to sexualities in their plural sense. All of those are demands that if you take them away from the conversation, you're left with a version of feminism that doesn't really change very much.
So one thing which we agree, but we cannot probably solve, but it's something to have very much at the back of of our heads, is how to address the question of inequalities which have this economic dimension, very important. But then when Shireen began her presentation, she talked about this incredibly powerful in our times loyalty towards identity, towards one's identity, whether racial, whether perhaps gender related, national, that we talked about it before, various forms of culturalism, cultural identity, and I'm just wondering to what extent, and this is something which I think disrupts democracy in incredible way, because we cling, and you show that, and because our experiences of the narratives that we were introduced to as children, as people who grew up, and our solidarities and loyalties are often bounded by that. What to do about that? Go ahead.
I have to say something.
Yeah.
Because it's absolutely uncanny. A few hours ago, a former student of mine, who is a professor in Ramallah, invited me to come to a conference
in Ramallah
about the conflict.
Nahed, yeah.
And we were...
That's the name of the student, Nahed, yeah.
It's Nahed Habiballah. And we were kind of sharing with each other our sense of despair and a need to act, our sense that nevertheless we must act, and trying to figure, this is actually a response to you, Elzbieta, trying to figure out, what do we do now, and what is the problem? And in fact, we realized that even though there are ways of imagining resolutions of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and of almost all conflicts, you can rationally figure out ways. But in fact, this has to do with embodiment too. We are so loyal to our identities, and people are so blinded by that loyalty that it makes it very, very difficult to do anything. Yeah, I mean, just
That's why democracy dies in darkness. Yeah.
I agree, but I think that we're bounded to identities because they are politicized in particular ways.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, what is, when people are confronted often with the consequences of what we might call blind loyalty, they shift. They shift. So I'm hopeful that people can shift.